Welcome everyone to the first episode of the Global Students Forum's podcast, How to Postgrad. Anyway, I would like to start this podcast by introducing the Global Students Forum. And the Global Students Forum was founded by the All African Students Union, the Commonwealth Students Association, European Students Union, Organizing Bureau of European School Students Union, and in 2019, that is when it started. It currently represents 202 democratically elected student unions from 122 countries, who collectively represent over 200 million students. So this podcast is run in partnership with the members of the Global Students Forum Working Group on Postgraduate Affairs, a team of young researchers from across the world who focus on issues relevant to postgraduates and research students. The group has already done a variety of different activities, including submitting a policy paper on research students globally to the UNESCO World Higher Education Conference in 2022, and are currently running a campaign called Let Us Move on postgraduate researcher mobility in study. Now, this podcast is another of their initiatives, and to share their thoughts and experiences in postgraduate and research spaces to fully help and support you through your research journey. I would like to introduce our first guests to our show, and these are amazing two women, Ellen Dixon and Jane Barry. So I'll just give us a small introduction of these amazing women and amazing scholars. So Ellen is a doctoral scholar in international relations and diplomacy, and she's going to introduce herself later on. So she has been in postgraduate student representation on campuses across New Zealand since 2017, holding the role of Vice President Advocacy at Victoria University of Wellington Postgraduate Students Association. She organized postgraduate action in 2021 at the New Zealand Union of Students Association, and that is the national body for 400,000 students in higher education, and also as the National Education Officer, then National Researcher. Before becoming the National President in 2023, she organizes also the Working Group on Postgraduate Affairs at the Global Students Forum, where she is a steering committee member, and also the chair of a political mandate of Quality Education for All. In addition to Ellen's amazing work, she is the regional engagement for the Pacific region. Jenna, who is also a great scholar, is a PhD student. Her current research focuses on virtual communities of practice for education, having specialized in studies of social and intellectual isolation among postgraduate students. Gina was also the 2021-2022 postgraduate representative for the Union of Students Ireland, the national body for more than 374,000 students in higher education across Ireland. Gina is the current chair for the Regional Universities Network Europe Students' Council, which is a group of 7, soon to be 9 connected European universities who focus on green, digital, and inclusive skills that help support the competitiveness of education institutions across the European Union and reduce existing regional development disparities. Now, these are great women. They have been in leadership position for a lot of students. Now I'm going to welcome Ellen and Jean into this great podcast, and we're going to listen to what they have for us today. So it is nice to have you here, Ellen and Jean. Kindly welcome to the podcast.
Thank you so much, Sherine. It's a pleasure to be here.
So I think we can start by talking about postgraduate student representation. You're both student unionists. You have specifically represented what we call the graduate or postgraduate students, which basically means to represent students in PhD students doing their masters, graduate certificates, or diploma students on your local campus and also nationally. So what is a postgraduate student representative and what do they do? So that we have some kind of order, I'll allow Ellen to share her thoughts.
Thanks so much, Sherine. It's a pleasure to be here with my colleague Jenna, who we've shared so many highs and lows over the last little while when it comes to discussing the elements of postgraduate representation. Postgraduate representation is a phenomena that occurs sometimes within a student union structure that is either a local or national body, but occasionally it also exists as an independent postgraduate body. They sit often working with academic staff members within an institution for the purposes of furthering the research student experience, ensuring that their journey is something that is equitable, is fair, is supportive, upholds well-being, and all sorts of things like that. In my time in working in postgraduate representation, a lot of my focus has been on advocacy, ensuring that topics like fair visa engagement for international students, because a lot of the time postgraduate students are from overseas studying at a university because they came for a particular area or course of study. Ensuring that there are significant resources available, such as even the basics, such as desks, anything to accessibility of libraries or journal articles through certain websites that can be included in some way. Specific case studies, sometimes working on particular advocacy cases when it may come down to things such as the need for accessibility within courses, if they're a tutor, or if they're like engaged in research in some way by being an assistant to an academic. So it's a very multifaceted system, and it's much more nuanced because it's tied to the academic side of an institution than your typical representation within a student union structure. So it's a very interesting space to be in, and it shows a level of commitment, I think, to the research with the people that you're working with in those spaces, but also reminds us of the importance of ensuring that those who are training to become a researcher, who are in that space of not entirely being, a researcher yet in terms of the way that the system views them in education and higher education, the modes of becoming maybe a doctorate student, and then stepping into being an early career researcher or a postdoc. It allows us to see that the student experience actually contributes to our research journey, and that is a very important time to be supporting a student through those parts of things. It's also important to realize, I think, when we're dealing with postgraduates, that a lot of students are now pursuing masters in order to get into working environments. So, we've had a very big change in the landscape of postgraduate degrees with the massification of them. So a number of those representatives who we are engaging with within the postgraduate space, whether it be through the working group that we have established here or as individual researchers, we have that interesting dynamic of some of us are going on to work for research institutes or governments within policy spaces, and then some of us are going to work in academia, but then a number of us will be going back into private enterprises and different spaces like that. So research is now kind of a passport to many, many spaces, which is both exciting, but also shows real developments in the lifelong learning model that we are now seeing in education. So postgraduate representation ties into the plethora of different things that we see in this space. And I turn over to Jenna to explain a little bit more her perspective of postgraduate representation.
I think that is very interesting, and probably into it, we will probably ask you how students can reach out to you, especially students, when you mentioned that students who come or visit institutions for their research. I think that will be a very interesting conversation to have, and students being able to know whom they can reach out to when they move to different countries, for mobility purposes. So yeah, Jenna, what are your responsibilities as a postgraduate representative? We are here to listen.
So I just wanted to say I'm so delighted to be here today and to speak with you and to explain to the listeners more about postgraduate research student representation, and to thank Ellen for her extensive explanation there. And I suppose from my own perspective, I believe that a postgraduate student representative is someone who's elected to represent postgraduate students. They seek to promote equality, prevent discrimination, and protect the human rights of each individual within education. Like the representatives can be like class, local, or national, or European, or global and international, as we've seen. So the responsibilities of a postgraduate student representative may vary depending on the specific institution or organisation, but their main aim is to ensure the voices and needs of postgraduate students are communicated effectively. I'm based in Ireland, so I'll explain the system there. So there are class department academic representatives who represent the students within their class or department. And these will be on the issues affecting their education, especially on academic issues like course material, online resources, and advocate for the needs and concerns of their fellow students. They would then liaise with the institutes, postgraduate representatives. To be honest, postgraduate representative is sparse. I think globally, but in Ireland, you know, some institutes do not have representation, some have part-time, some have full-time. But again, this is an area that really needs to be improved. So the institute's postgraduate representatives are located within the institution, and they represent students, organise activities and events, sit on academic council, governing body, subcommittee for postgraduate education, and they would liaise with national postgraduate representatives in Ireland. So I worked as the Vice President for Postgraduate Affairs for the Union of Students in Ireland, which is the national student union within Ireland, which was a part-time role of 2 days a week. I could have done with 100 days a week. And the role was to represent the interests of postgraduate students nationally and work towards improving their experience in education and opportunities they would have after their education. So my role consisted on working on advocating for the interest of postgraduate students to ensure the quality of education, funding, resources and support services, communicating with stakeholders. So you may communicate with government agencies, academic organisations and other stakeholders to ensure that the concerns of a postgraduate student are heard and addressed. Would sit on national, European and international committees, boards and working groups, and work on the Union of Students Ireland. Obviously the acronym is USI, so work on USI's policy relating to postgraduates. These policies would have been determined by students that are affiliated to USI, and postgraduate engagement, which is always difficult. You have to find the postgraduates first, because no doubt they have their heads stuck in a book or a computer somewhere or a lab. Creation and coordination of events and campaigns in cooperation with the Vice President of Campaigns, chairing the postgraduate working group, attending working groups, implementing student union training. So some of the boards, working groups, etc., I would have sat on would have been the European Council of Doctoral Candidates and Junior Researchers, the National Framework for Doctoral Education Advisory Forum in Ireland, Research Graduate Education Committee, the Postgraduate Research Student Survey Editorial Working Group. So I was the chairperson of the Postgraduate Student Engagement Working Group, and on the National Postgraduate Working Group, and also the Global Student Forum Postgraduate Working Group. There's a whole host of areas you can become involved there, to name a few, but there certainly would be more that I could add to that. So I will conclude with that. Thank you, Sherine.
Thank you very much, Jenna, for breaking that down on what leaders like you at the postgraduate level are actually doing for their colleagues. So it is interesting to hear that all of these situations are occurring, for postgraduate students. And why is it important to have postgraduate representatives in student union structures on our campuses, but also at the national level? What inspired you to be involved as a representative for postgraduate and research students in the first place. So I think this time round we'll have Jenna like give us, her insight on what it means.
So I'm probably coming from a different perspective. I remember in my undergraduate, I'm a mature student, so my undergraduate was a while ago, that I had been asked to run for the student union, and I felt it was a popularity contest, so I refused. And I'd always kind of felt like that, and felt that the student union was particularly student politics. And I don't think I'd realised actually that it's really just about human contact and improving situations for people. So I had never been involved in a union, and I did not know what to expect. Someone approached me as my research involved implementing an online community to support the intellectual and social growth of postgraduate students at my higher education institution. So the postgraduate representative for the Union of Students Ireland for the previous year approached me, and we had a chat about what the role entailed. And it just fascinated me what was involved. And I took on the role because I wanted to support other students, to give postgraduate students a voice, and to let other students know they were not alone on their journey. I did not know what I was getting myself in for, I have to say, and it certainly was a baptism of fire, but one I will never regret. I thoroughly enjoyed my year as a postgraduate representative with USI. I think it's changed the trajectory of my life, of my career. I have met the most amazing people along the journey. And I certainly wouldn't be here involved with the Global Student Forum if I hadn't joined the Union of Students Ireland. And it's not just political representation. I really believe it's about people. If you're passionate about people, if you're passionate about making a change, if you're passionate about supporting others, please, get into student politics, and, please, get into your student unions. And I want other people to know you do not have to be experienced to join your student union. You just need to give it a go. And there's so many opportunities to be able to support and help students between, welfare, you can support international students. There's equality, diversity and inclusion. There's campaigns. So if you're interested in social media, there's obviously the president roles, the vice president deputy, the postgraduate roles, just even as a class rep. My president started as a class rep and worked her way up through the different roles to become the national president for the Union of Students Ireland. So, every small input is so important. So that's what I would say, that it's an opportunity even to make friends and find other people that are kind and supportive and caring and want to improve other people's lives. So yeah, that answer was a bit longer than I had anticipated, but that's just my version.
Yeah, I think that's very interesting to hear that you were, once a student leader in your student union. I think I also come from that particular background of, not knowing anything that involved politics and, putting out my foot out there and saying, you know what, I'm going to do this. If I fail, that's fine. And there is always a lot of politics especially at the lowest level, which is at the undergraduate level. There is, politics that we think only happens at the national level, but clearly politics is everywhere. So I think also from my experience was that I got into student politics or student leadership, a very young girl, with no experience, with nobody to tell me what to do. I was just like, out there asking people to vote for me because, you know, I'm the change that they wanted. And it was a very interesting time as a student, also in the university, because then it gave me an opportunity to, you know, sit in the Senate board and listen to, you know, professors debate on some of the changes that they needed in their departments, you know, the postgraduate group coming on board. Of course, at that time, I didn't understand where all this was going to, because I only had the interest of the undergraduate students. So I think the more, if you get into that space as a young person in your undergraduate, doing your diploma, it then gives you a sense of belonging and a sense of direction to, you know, keep on, you know, advocating for the voices of students in different spaces. So, Ellen, what do you think?
I just wanted to say how much I love this conversation. Thank you both so much for sharing your journey in that space. It's always so enlightening to see the passion behind the activism that people do, and how they got to where they are. So it's a real privilege to share in these narratives with you. Mine was very similar to Jenna. I got tapped on the shoulder for a role, which I had very adamantly said multiple times over I would not do. I said to myself when I went into my degree, I will not do education or politics. And look what I'm in now. So I think something in life is laughing at me and saying, ha, irony. So my journey in student politics was not intentional by any means. I started off on my campus very cynical about education. I grew up in a heritage of teachers. My mother's a teacher, my uncles and aunts are teachers, my cousins are teachers, my grandmother was a teacher, my brother's training to be a teacher. I like to say that teachers run in your DNA, in your blood. So do activists, I think, as well, because, you know, we had this intergenerational element of education. And I grew up hearing about the neoliberalisation of the education sector, particularly for primary and secondary school, because New Zealand was basically treated as a social experiment for about 40 years, introducing very strong neoliberal policies and basically treating itself as if it were a developing nation in order to try and recreate our education system. And what we ended up was with education products. I hate those words. Education products instead of education as a human right, which Jenna has already talked about is so essential. So when I went from school, which I was not the best student in terms of attitude towards, even though people didn't really know that, because I'd grown up in an environment where we were taught to question curricula, where we were taught to question the way the pedagogical structure worked. And when I went into official school-based structures, they didn't like that. So I went into university and, you know, you have your idealized version of the university. You think that you're going to be there for the pursuit of knowledge and academic freedom. And in reality, what happens is you find out that the education system within higher education has also been turned into a bit of a neoliberal space full of technocrats, or at least being encroached upon by technocrats. So I ended up very disillusioned with that as well, because at the time I'd been trying to produce some type of research that was very innovative and new and was using very up-to-date research within a school that was basically had a split in scholarship, so a split in the way that it was looking at the work. And as a result of which it ended up in a kind of a disagreement within the school as to whether or not my scholarship was considered something that they would support. And that was even before I was into my postgraduate study, because I was doing independent research in my second year. So by the stage that I was in my master's that I started at Mass University, I had noticed all these issues in scholarship that were going on, which were all academic issues. And I was contesting with them at the school level, and they kept on saying to me, like, who are you? You don't, like, what do you know about this subject? And I was like, but I've read all the literature and, you know, I've invested myself in this space. And I was talking with other students about it, and there was a lot of agreement in those elements. So I ended up going to the student union and saying, we're having basically an issue where, unfortunately, because of the insecurity within the school, partly because of precarious working situations, then actually blocking new scholarship coming through. And the student union, which is very much what Sherine said, full of largely undergraduate students, because they're the most mobile when it comes to university spaces, were like, we have absolutely no idea how to deal with that, because we did not have a local postgraduate body. So they asked me, will you be our postgraduate representative and advocate on these issues, basically? And I said no. And I didn't want to be involved in this space. I was quite over it. And then we had a series of different incidences that happened on campus. First of all, we had an incident of there was a particular political figure who was meaning to come to campus, and then there was a threat against him because of some of the things that he'd said, which were ethnically insensitive to many people, and that caused a lot of hurt and harm. And then we had another incident that followed soon after that, which was again a question to do with academic freedom versus the well-being of students, caused another shutdown within the university of a similar event, which had some very conservative right-wing speakers in it, which we were all wondering why they'd prioritised that. I then moved to do my master's at the University of Canterbury, and in that year I was sort of helping out on the side with the Students' Association. But what ended up happening during that period of my master's is that I was in a course with a woman who was actually being spied on by a government from overseas. So we went into an environment in our postgraduate studies that was very suspicious. There were a lot of people looking at each other, wondering if our conversations were being recorded and things like that. A lot of questions regarding academic rights. And then only a few months after that, there was a hate crime that was committed only a few blocks down from where we were in the university space, towards one of the mosques that was there, which they killed 51 people. It was a lone wolf actor. And at that stage, it kind of just dawned on me that the human rights of students in these spaces was not something that I could ignore. I had been very cynical about the student union system because since voluntary student membership that happened in my country, there's no universal connection with student unions, which means it's largely just undergraduates who are enthusiastic about the idea of having a leadership role. And what I was seeing was that there was this blocking in scholarship that was going on, and the protections for students literally to do with their physical safety was something that was in danger in some of these spaces. So then I tried for the national union role and ended up getting that, and then started intersecting between different groups like early career researchers, really working to try and get governance structures between, your under 35 groups that were in our tertiary education union, trying to cross-section them with a number of other tutor-based groups who were dealing with precarious contracts and things like that. And that's how it kind of evolved from there. We kept on seeing these situations, particularly post-pandemic, where, where traditionally, I think Jenna was saying, the postgraduate was kind of like in their office and just expected to be in that space. They weren't largely politically active during the last couple of years. Maybe they were during the period of the 70s, 80s, but it kind of lessened. We have now seen that the pandemic has created this sort of cost of living crisis, the global education crisis, and as a result of which we're seeing these postgraduates come out more and actually discuss what that is occurring for them, whether it be in stipends, whether it be in training-based engagements. Yeah, all of these types of things, it's incredibly important to see. And from that, ended up in the global student movement, where I ended up automatically being involved in the postgraduate working group that we have here today, because I advocated it on the basis of the campaigns we were doing. So not at all a linear story as to how this happened, but always to do with the values of research as a social good in accordance with education as a social good, rather than this sort of narrative of the researcher as, a wealthy individual, which I think is the false idea that we have. We've got this very old-fashioned idea of the sort of colonial university where only a few are able to engage. Really, what we see today is postgraduate engagement and postgraduate research in particular is now a very complicated space, convoluted by the cost of living crisis and all sorts of other dynamics that connect with the erosion of education in general as a social good. So yeah, very long explanation, but yeah, that's a bit of my narrative.
Yeah. I think that was clear, and the fact that you've actually done something and made a win out of it, that's great. So I think, Gina, maybe you can add something on to what you already have.
Yes, please. I'd love to. Now, before I add on a little point, I just wanted to say, my God, Ellen, what a journey. Even though I know you, I didn't know of your journey. And I just wanted to say as well, sorry to hear of the tragedy that happened in your locality. Like, that deeply saddens me. That's like so sad for so many people, and the domino effect of something like that can be so traumatic and affect like a whole community. It's so sad.
Thanks so much, Jenna.
No problem. So there was one thing that dawned on me when we were chatting, and it was just the fact of and it happened when I joined the student union, and when I joined, student politics as we call it. I still don't see it as politics per se. I see it as representing people. I suppose they're one and alike. but the terminology can be frightening. So when we're talking about academic council and governing body and all these things that, you know, students may not know about, don't leave the terminology that you don't understand scare you from joining the union. It's like every other aspect of life. You'll learn it once you're in there. You'll learn on the ground. You'll pick up these words, you know, and they're not as scary as they sound. So please, please, please get involved in a small capacity, even if it's an hour a week. You will be surprised about the amazing people you meet, the friends you make. It's such a worthwhile journey. That's what I wanted to add. Thank you, Sherine. Thank you, Ellen, for leading me out to that point.
Thank you. Thank you, Jenna. So it is clear that not all situations for postgraduate students on campus are good. And so there are issues with stipends, supervision, mental health, and well-being, which I have been reading a lot of, you know, tweet chats about this, imposter syndromes, and many other things that you great, amazing scholars have talked about up there. So many of these topics were addressed in a document that you both wrote as part of the Global Students Forum Working Group on Postgraduate Affairs that was submitted to, you know, UNESCO World Higher Education Conference in 2022. So the paper was called Research Students in Higher Education Globally, and it covered 3 core topics that the postgraduate group thought was very important. And one of the topics was nurturing the research students' experience, supporting the research process, and professional development in the research student journey. Can you tell us why this document was important and the key points that you were trying to make from it so that our listeners are able to know the kind of information that is out there for them?
I'm happy to jump in and start on that one, Sherine, because this was
that's okay.
my core projects that happened last year. And Jenna was an amazing person on that team who worked on this with me. So I was incredibly grateful for her help. This document was written for really the reason that Jenna was actually trying to get at in her last point. You know, one of the things that we see a lot of is that the research journey is often quite individual, and that's because you become a researcher in a niche topic unless you are in taught courses, which look a little bit more like the graduate courses, where you have more of a cohort experience. But when we see like the research experience that happens when you are maybe bachelor honors student, master's student, doctoral student, is that we see the sort of individualistic niche research come forward, which then sometimes sacrifices those communities of practice, which Jenna knows so well because this is her area of research. So what we wanted to write in this document was first and foremost trying to find a way to integrate your research students in particular, not just postgraduate students, but your research students, into a situation where they felt a sense of belonging. And that belonging was partly to do with the human rights element. So non-discrimination and research student inclusion was quite a big part of that, particularly with the mental health facet that's attached. And that's partly because when we think of supervision that happens within postgraduate experiences, it is actually incredibly common for supervisors within higher education institutions to not be trained in cultural competency and to not be trained in mental health awareness. In fact, it's incredibly normal too that the stress and the pressure of doing a research project these days, because often you're doing it while being a tutor, maybe you have a job, maybe you're doing several other things, maybe you're a student representative like we are. You're often doing that in addition to research, and that can be a lot for a research student to engage with in particular. So either you can end up isolated on the one hand, or you can end up so incredibly pressurized that you are kind of wondering, how am I meant to juggle all of these things that are part of my life? And what's worse is that institutions are increasingly normalizing this behavior and saying, you know, burnout culture within research spaces is normal. You should be just naturalizing it. I've sat through PhD seminars where they're introducing new PhD students to the sort of process of writing your doctorate, and they say, oh yes, you will have a period of burnout, it is normal. That is atrocious. They should not be saying that. If you have a normal period of burnout, that is actually because the research experience is not sustainable. So number one was to ensure that students know that they should not have to tolerate power imbalances within that space where they feel like they're being discriminated against, where they feel like they're isolated, they're alone, that they don't have support for their well-being and mental health. And that comes to the second element, which is supporting the research process, which is largely in connection to your supervision experience. Supervision either makes or breaks a project. Anyone who's been in supervision knows this. If you have a great supervisor, often you will fly and succeed. And if you don't have a good supervision relationship, for example, if you see it purely as a power dynamic, or if your supervisor doesn't understand your project, or if you're doing mass supervision, I've heard of that before, can be quite a damaging process. Also, if your supervisor doesn't understand how to recommend sort of like ethical practices to help you through that sort of almost apprenticeship model in research, which is kind of what the research experience is meant to be. If they're not like able to train you in what academic freedom means for you and how it's actually often legislated either at your national level from a governmental perspective, or you can access it from the 1997 document that was written by UNESCO, which actually highlights the importance of academic freedom for all people in these spaces who are doing research. Often you can find that your research scholarship can struggle, and we don't want people to feel like they're isolated and alone in that. So often I say to postgraduates, I'm like, did you know that you're allowed to say to your supervisor, this is what I feel like I should be doing, rather than just allowing your supervisor to be like, I think you should do this, I think you should do that, and then it changing the trajectory of the research. A lot of people don't know that research is supposed to be a conversation with your supervisor rather than an instruction. The other element that we focused on within this document was professional development in the researcher journey, which is largely to do with financial resourcing, the accessibility in terms of going between nations, mobility, which is largely what we're campaigning on at the moment, sustainable workplaces and professional development opportunities. So like when you're a tutor, when you're a postgraduate researcher, we don't want you to be getting into a situation where you're basically on the variation of a 0-hour contract. Or something that could be considered exploitive, where you're not being paid for the hours that you're working, which unfortunately happens quite a bit these days because gig work has become so popular. But yeah, that's a little bit of an overview, and we particularly presented at the World Higher Education Conference because we wanted this to be something that was articulated. It's largely not really talked about other than at sometimes the local or the national level when it comes to a postgraduate experience, and that's largely because certain regions have actually legislated well-being and protections for the student rights of a postgraduate, such as where Jenna is. They've just started to do that at the national level in Ireland. And then also some of it sits within the EHEA, which is the European higher education area. But many nations and many regions don't have these types of protections available, and students don't know that they can ask for them. So that's really why we wrote this document and what it was focusing on.
Okay, that's very insightful, and I hope postgrad students are able to listen to all this and just follow up and try to do some of the things that you've actually mentioned. So Gina, what are your thoughts?
So obviously Ellen has made so many valid points, and I'd like to reiterate all of those points. So Ellen talks about this burnout culture, which is really prevalent in higher education institutions, not just for students, but also for staff and academics. I hear about it so regularly that it's I suppose, disappointing that we're not supported more. Students are doing so many hours between, obviously, the lecturing and at the end of this, postgraduate students want a career. So they're afraid to say no to all these extra tasks, and they can become overburdened with a lot of responsibilities. I also want to say Ellen referred to my own research in communities of practice. And I just want to explain a community practice is basically a community where people share their practice. So I believe communities are areas in every form of life that should be nurtured for people to be able to communicate and share and become involved with one another. As I said, because it is so difficult for postgraduates when they're stuck at a desk or when they're involved in their own autonomous research. And regarding the document, it's hard to single out 3 key points. All the topics within that are so important. And I suppose because an individual's journey within research is so individual, some of the points will be more important to some students than others. Obviously, international students may have different issues than local students within an institution. And obviously each point has value in the bigger scheme of postgraduate education. And unfortunately, the issues are stacked like dominoes, and each impacts the next. It's like a little chain reaction. Obviously, the recommendations within the document are divided into 3 sections, incorporating the research student experience, and that would be, I suppose, attrition, education, the funding, equality, diversity, and inclusion. And the second point in the recommendations would be supporting the research process. And that includes supervision, postgraduate research representation, and including a student-centered approach. And the third would be professional development in the research student journey, including national reforms, workplace practices, and research that contributes towards a local, national, regional, and global sustainable development. And I'm sure that document will be shared within this podcast or somewhere along, so people can have a look at that. But I suppose if I was really to choose maybe 3 areas that I believe needs a lot of work on, and that is a core within all postgraduate education, it would be funding. Funding is massive. Obviously, if people don't have funding, they can't do postgraduate education. The structures within supervision are so important, because a student doesn't have classes, they don't engage with postgraduates at the same level that undergraduates do, and their main engagement may be with their supervisor. So to have a good supervisor who supports you emotionally, physically, educationally, academically, the list is endless on how your supervisor may be able to support. And I suppose the third would be around research culture and community. Again, you can't underestimate the importance and support that a community can bring. Community is so important to the sense of belonging and to reduce the social and intellectual isolation, which again can be prevalent, and with attrition rates of up to 70% in PhD or postgraduate research education globally. It's so important to have that sense of community for people to understand that the emotions that they're going through, or the perceived isolation that they are going through, is not isolated to one particular student, but seems to be something that is prevalent within postgraduate research education. And it's great to have that bar to be able to discuss and explain, and sometimes complain about because a research journey is very much peaks and troughs. So I suppose for other students to know that they can celebrate their wins with other students, and they have someone to speak to when the going gets tough is so important.
This makes it sound like it's quite difficult to be a research student and today, because then there is how the society sees you as a researcher, and then there is the expectation that you have for yourself and the expectation that the society has on you. So I think this is really an interesting thing when you think about the idea that higher education often comes from a position of privilege in the society, and especially from where I come from. Undergraduate is enough. In fact, that's like the best of the best. And so for you to get into doing your master's and your PhD, then it's not really a conversation that a lot of households are actually having, And so we often think that those who are studying to be researchers or academics, and especially doing master's and PhD, are coming from a position of privilege. privilege, and that they make a lot of money, and they have good jobs and they have very good connections. So what would you say that this is the case? How is it, for even the students that you have been leading, for the positions that you've been having? Are there students who've been reaching out for help with such kind of issues, and how have you been handling them? So Gina, what do you think?
Thank you, Sherine. It's postgraduate education. It is a minefield, I have to say. And one of the things that dawned on me last year, even though we're called in Ireland, we're called postgraduate research students. In my institution, we have staff emails. So I believe sometimes we're seen as staff when it suits, and sometimes we're seen as students when it suits. I suppose technically we're not students. We have graduated from an undergraduate degree. And within industry in Ireland, graduate students earn 28,000, which is seen as obviously a good wage. It's above the minimum average. It's above the living wage, I believe. So, and I believe that postgraduate students should be seen as the same. We're talented, educated, passionate, hardworking individuals who go back to do research within their university, and it can be terribly hard work, and as I said, the peaks and troughs can make it quite difficult, but very, very rewarding. Don't get me wrong, I think it's the best thing I've ever done. It's opened up my world in huge ways. But I suppose research postgraduates in Ireland sometimes pay to do their research for the university. They can be paid nothing, or as little as 6,000 a year, and more commonly at the moment between 12,000 and 18,500 a year, which may seem like a lot in other countries, but it's actually not, especially with the housing crisis in Ireland at the moment. And everything is relevant, so the money is relevant to what is paid out, and it certainly is not enough. 12,000 is actually less than people who beneficiaries of social welfare within Ireland receive. So, people who are being supported by the government are, are provided with more than 12,000 a year. So for postgraduate research students to receive that amount is disappointing, because it's not enough to survive on, basically. PhD students and student organisations have done a lot of canvassing in Ireland. So they've been canvassing, campaigning, lobbying and advocating to the Minister of Further and Higher Education, Innovation and Science is going to do a review of state supports for PhD researchers in Ireland, and that's open at the moment until the 13th of March. So if you are an Irish postgraduate research student listening to this, have your say. So he has actually said that we want Ireland to be a leader in talent, so we have to ensure that our brightest talent here in Ireland can pursue their research ambitions in a supportive environment, and that he looks forward to receiving the report's recommendations. So, that's, I suppose, a huge step for Irish postgraduate education. And I'm delighted that we all have a say, because it's a public consultation. So it is open to individuals, but also to postgraduate unions or postgraduate representatives in Ireland. So I really look forward to the outcome of this report.
Amazing, and especially with the Ireland students, I hope they're able to listen to this and reach out. And just to tell you that the link of the document that the postgraduate students worked on, and I think Ellen and you led it and co-led it, will be attached to this podcast so that we're able to, refer to the document and look at some of the things. So yeah, I think it's very important, and I would ask Ellen to tell us something about this as well.
Thanks, Sherine. I think Jenna covered a very important set of points. One of the things that I should start off by saying is that people should not be discouraged just because they're hearing this from avoiding doing a postgraduate degree, just because it is a difficult environment to be in, but it's also an incredible learning experience. And, any type of learning, you're going to encounter different parts of the system that you either don't know or you may be challenged when first encountering. But I like to remind people that anyone who does research is typically quite passionate about research. I work with the science community on and off, aiding them in science communication in Aotearoa, New Zealand. And they are some of the most passionate people that I know about science. They are so committed to ensuring that the areas that they look at within microbiology and genomics and other elements of that are understood by the public or by their other peers within their spaces. So, research is something that people do because they're passionate more often than not. So, I think also once a person understands how research can contribute to policy development within a nation, how, intellectualism can actually play a significant role, not in judging the rest of the class system or structure within any nation, but in actually aiding, collaborating conversations that can direct how nations work, how communities work, sometimes how global spaces work. I think you realize that there's power in research. And we don't often talk about that. At the moment, we've got a gap at the national level and at the global level between research contributing to policy, and it's because we don't talk about how beneficial research can be in transforming people's actual lives, which I think Jenna was talking about a little earlier. So I want to start off with that before we go into some of the difficulties. But first and foremost, I do think we do have to acknowledge, as you were saying earlier, Sherine, that the Global South often does have this perception that going to a global north university, getting your master's or your PhD means that you're somehow like ahead, you've managed to get ahead, you've managed to get out of the poverty trap, basically. And that's somewhat true and it's somewhat not. So I remember I went and had a talk with the CEOs of one of the important groups that are over universities in my country. And he said to me, Ellen, you should not be doing PhD because I can show you that you won't be paid as much than if you did your master's and then went into the private sector and basically worked for them. And he showed me the numbers off the basis of the data they'd been collecting. And it was an interesting moment because you got these false perceptions that happen that you think that if you study at a global north university, not that I perceive this, but you're expecting to have the fancy car and you're expecting to be a fancy intellectual, and that's actually not what it is anymore. But also because I think the global south hasn't had the ability to be able to invest in their structures as much as the global north has. They've had the wealth to be able to invest in creating these overarching education systems, whereas global south nations such as the Africa region, for example, doesn't actually feed a lot of money into its research institutions because there are other immediate issues that are more important. So I think we need to recognize that first and foremost. But then the issue is you get someone who may be idealizing the idea of the master's or the PhD process and maybe even coming from the global south with that perception because, it's like, oh, I'll raise my community higher. And then you get there and you realize that it's not what you were expecting. And what you actually encounter is a complex process. It's an imperfect process, and it's largely, as I said, the neoliberalization of education. For example, in Australia, last year and the year earlier, there's been ongoing issues regarding what we call postgraduate wage theft, which is where casual work and fixed-term contracts, basically gig academy work, has been built into the university system. So they're not paying postgraduates who are engaging in things such as marking, or if they are engaging in aiding in research projects and things like that. Basically, a number of Australian universities were held to account for the fact that they were not paying them for the hours that they were working, so they were getting work for free. I believe that there was some type of claim that one university alone had underpaid as much as 30 million Australian dollars to casual staff members, which is quite a significant amount, even in terms of like US dollars, for example, because they had been so dependent upon basically exploiting postgraduate students to get hours out of them. And that's because, you know, we've really turned to this consumerist-based structure, even in universities such as the big private Ivy League ones. You know, when we think about Harvard, or when we think about, you know, Cornell, all these big ones, they're still using the structure, and it is an exploitative structure. But the other element that I think that Jenna brought up, which was really important, is that the financial side of higher education, particularly postgraduate spaces, has not kept up with the realities, even in living in the global north. We've actually discovered these days that a lot of our postgraduate students, even in the global north, are actually in the lower middle classes in terms of what they are being paid, and they are about to slip into the poverty gap again, you know, that trap that is sitting right there, even in the global north. Like, you'd think where there's money in the global north, where you have philanthropists who can fund this type of thing, that stipends would be able to pay for those types of things, but they're not, because like a lot of them are not adjusted for inflation. They're not going up with the cost of living crises. So you can even get someone who's come from a poorer nation and then steps into poverty in a considered wealthier nation. And then we also have the other dynamics that happen within that space, that our institutions are completely swamped now with the prevalence of copyrights and patents, and that's largely the way that they are funding what is considered innovative research, which means that we're pursuing the privatization of our own institutions rather than the innovation of education. Plus, we've also seen the rise of right-wing commentaries, which are very anti-intellectual, which in all honesty, we've probably already achieved that anti-intellectualism within the institution because we've already given over to this privatized structure. So it's a very imperfect system. And I really encourage the people to come to this space who are passionate about education within these contexts. It's not just a passport ticket to a new life. It is also an element of exploration into what is higher education? What is research? How do you want to craft that? How do you want to talk about the social issues that sit around research, either in the research that you're doing or around the context of being a student in research? So there's many, many different elements. It shouldn't discourage you from getting involved, because it's an incredible process, writing your own piece of work that you have completely created. It's your baby, you know, you've raised it, it's grown, it's had a community that may have potentially built into it. But we also have to recognize that the structure that has been around it for many, many years has been something that's been focused largely on the financial side of education ever since we saw this massification of education. So yeah, positives and negatives, as in all things.
I think the both of you have actually broken down a lot of things into a way in which we can understand this as master's, PhD, undergraduate students need to understand it. And, you know, as you were talking about it, it reminded me of, you know, what you were saying before regarding the situation that you experience with postgraduate students on campuses. Especially, Jenna mentioned that when you were helping them out in their roles, and I must admit that I had a similar experience. And before we started this podcast, I think I shared it with Ellen, and I was like, what do you think if we need about us talking to, you know, students out there who've like cleared their undergraduate and they don't know how to navigate and get into, you know, the postgrad space. And I remember when I'd done my undergraduate and there was this excitement about me finishing my 4th year, and because I was doing a 4-year course, and, you know, getting to do my master's and getting to do my PhD and then being able to teach. And I was having a conversation with one of the students who was a master's student in my university then, and she was like, it might not really pay you much, but it's a nice experience. And so navigating how and what course you want to do, and especially if you're fresh from your undergraduate and you have all these ideas coming on board and you're trying to decide, what should I do? Should I do A? Should I do B? And I feel like there is very minimal information on what students who are transitioning immediately from their undergraduate to their masters have. So I hope that this podcast is able to be that bridge. We're able to build that bridge as the Global Students Forum and even as postgraduate students working group under the Global Students Forum, we're able to bridge that gap. And, students who are transitioning immediately are able to understand. I know there are people who get into their masters when they've gone to the work market and they've identified what they really need to do, because I really struggled with that. On my first semester, I was like, do I really want to do this? Should I stop? And should I continue? And should I do another second one? And I think Ellen brought it out and said, you know what? You can actually be a great researcher from whatever field that you're able to do. And I think that is why it was very important for her to come as our pioneering, guests, and even Jenna, because then Jenna has been working with students for a very long time. So I wish that I had known a lot of things before I started my master's, but the key takeaway for me as a new master, let me just call myself new, is that we need to get enough information before we actually begin our journey for masters. Do you want to get into research? Do you just want to do your masters so that you're able to have the extra skill that you need for your employment that you're probably looking forward to? And what are the opportunities that you really need to look out to? Because at the end of the day, you need to take care of yourself. You need to pay tax, and you need to pay tax with money. So and this makes me wonder what type of advice you'd give to a postgraduate or research student going to study, whatever field they're getting into. What advice would you give them? I think probably this will be our last conversation. So Ellen probably will tell us about that, and then Jenna will probably tell us what you think the postgrad or research student who is the new entry should think about or do.
Thanks so much, Sherine. Yeah, I think it's always the $1 million question when it comes into these spaces. It's like, what would I have wanted to know before I started? So I very much appreciate that question that you said. Often it seems we learn on the job. We're finding out as we go along, and it's quite overwhelming for many people, and they realize all the layers to the system, whether it be in educational governance, whether it be accessibility and funding, whether it be the context of the space that they may have moved to if they're an international student coming to study in another country, and also they get more used to their actual research, like their scholarship, so they now know maybe I should have gone over here to study instead of over there. I think the recommendation I would be is, first and foremost, don't be too hard on yourself. It is a learning experience, which means you're not expected to understand everything the minute that you step into that space. Second of all, actually investigate the element of research that you're wanting to do, the people who you're wanting to work with. I always encourage, instead of just applying for a master's or PhD, if it includes supervision, go find someone who you want to supervise you. Or find people within your field who you can work with. Go send them an email before you've even start a conversation with them. That's really important. Look at the benefits that are available to postgraduate students on your campus. Is there a support service for postgraduates? Is there an academic writing service for postgraduates? Are there opportunities for engagement in programs like tutoring-based spaces or research assistance or lab assistance or whatever it is that you're engaged with? What do they pay? How do they treat people? What does that look like? Try and find yourself a community of practice that's supportive for you. But also, as Jenna and I think will really reiterate in this space, look to see that you actually have a student union who's supportive of you. And if you're employed by your institution, in addition to doing your research at the time as a postgrad, look to see your tertiary education union that is in that space that you can work with. They will help you when it comes to a contractual basis, because a lot of this work is governed actually by contracts, whether it be your actual supervision relationship or whether it be your working relationship with the institution. Look at people who are able to help you with the negotiations of that and who have been through the postgraduate process before. I think these are the key elements that we need to really focus on within these spaces. Don't be naive stepping into your space in education, but also don't overburden yourself. Mm-hmm. If you encounter an element of burnout, if you feel like you're not being supported, go find people who can support you. Don't be afraid to talk up about it. I know particularly within different cultures who may feel like it's taboo to talk about when you're not feeling like you're doing well. We actually need to support each other because a lot of us go through this process. It's a big thing to do a piece of research. So it's really an encouragement. Don't feel afraid to reach out, and don't be afraid to actually investigate what you're stepping into in the first place. There are supports available for you, but it requires you actually looking to see what scholarships are there, what stipends are there. You know, it's a really nice idea to do research, and then when we're in it, it's a very big project, but it's also an exciting one. So holding that balance, I think, is really, really key. But yes, absolutely join in your postgraduate representation. You will find so many passionate people. They will be able to support you on your journey through that. And I'll turn over to Jenna for some wise words before we end our session.
Absolutely. I reiterate a lot of Ellen's points, and being an academic, you know, or an academic student, a research student, has so many opportunities. And it is exciting to be in the pursuit of new knowledge, to develop new knowledge, to be able to promote new knowledge in an area you're passionate about. And I would say to everyone, take a leap of faith. Go and do it. Go and try it. You never know until you try. And I just want to, like, before I go into like what you really should know on a more formal level, I will just say the friends you make are amazing. The opportunities open to you can be great. The travel you get to do is exciting. You know, there's mobility involved in some institutions. You learn the most amazing things. You get the connections to great minds, to passionate, excited, intelligent people. And if you have I have a really curious mind, and I'm very inquisitive. So I feel this is the space I should have found like a million years ago. It's where I belong. And it just took me a little while longer than most to find it. But I feel I'm where I'm supposed to be, if that makes sense. So I suppose the formal kind of stuff that I would advise students to look into before undertaking research would be your research interests. So it's essential to kind of think about what you want to research before applying for a PhD program, and how you can research a topic you're interested in. Because remember, you will be on this research topic for a minimum of 4 years. Now that time will fly in one essence, you know, in one aspect, but also that time can drag on if you're really not interested in the subject and, you know, you're yawning at the papers you're reading. That 4 years minimum, as I said, it can go on. I've heard of people, you know, 5 years, 6 years, 7 years, 8 years, 9 years, you know, especially if you go part-time, it, you know, that the amount of time you spend on the research can definitely extend. So be interested in your subject. So program requirements, each PhD program may have different requirements between coursework and projects, and most don't have exams, but, you know, I'm only aware of the Irish system. So you should definitely have a look at the requirements of the program, whether you have to, some who provide stipends, which is the funding for the program, may expect free teaching in return. So just be prepared of what's expected of you. Different programs are funded, there's different stipend amounts, there's government funded programs. So have a look at the funding. I would put in Google postgraduate funding, and I believe there is a European website where you can, and I will share it afterwards, where you can look for different PhD programs which generally seem to be funded, and you can apply for them. So the time commitment, as I said, it's 4 years minimum. It's a long-term commitment. And by the time you complete, it probably will be minimum 5 years by the time you write your document. So you're looking at possibly 40,000 if you combine with a project, which is a practice. I don't think a lot of people have heard about this, but it's called an exegesis, and it's a practice-based PhD, where half your PhD is your practice. So that could be dancing, art, as I said, project-based work, and 40,000 word dissertation, which I had never heard about, because normally the PhD you hear about is the word count, a minimum word count, of 80,000 words. And people become really scared because a lot of people are afraid of writing. They don't trust their writing skills. And don't get me wrong, PhDs in general are no different. The writing part of my PhD fills me with dread. I'm imposter syndrome comes in. I don't feel my writing is good enough. And I think people, undergraduates especially, have this perception that PhDs love writing. I think PhDs are curious, inquisitive minds who love research. And I do, obviously, there's a small population of PhD students that love writing. But I don't think that's the general consensus. So don't leave the writing frighten you, is what I'm saying. So make sure the supervisor is interested in the research you're doing. If you can, meet the supervisor before you decide to undertake the research, have a conversation on how they like to work, on how you like to work. And hopefully there's a general consensus on how you'd like to move forward with your research. The other thing is, I would advise, look for mentors. Look for people who are interested in your research within the academic world that can support you outside of your supervisor. A supervisor is only one person, and they lecture, they have all other they may have lots of other students outside of you. So don't forget that you are just a little speck on their day-to-day. So do surround yourself with people, whether it be other students, other researchers, academics, lecturers, and policymakers, everyone interested in your field. So do try and factor in all the different parts. Work-life balance. Where do I start with this one? PhD students are not good at work-life balance. A PhD is demanding, it is stressful, and it's important to try and prioritize your mental and physical health, whether that's some mindfulness, whether it's going for a cup of coffee with friends, and taking breaks to engage in self-care activities. Absolutely try and take care of yourself outside of your research. And I suppose it's careful to consider all those factors and determine if a PhD program is the right fit for your academic and career goals overall. Because you spend so much time in it, you invest so much in it. It's so important to realize what you want to, I suppose, engage with at the other side of this research. But it's hard. Like I say this, but like my mind changes. When I started, I was going to be a lecturer, and then becoming involved with the students' union. I'm interested in policy, and now I'm also interested in research engagement for societal impact. And this has opened up so many doors that the day-to-day trajectory of my overall career in the end keeps changing. So don't underestimate, and don't underestimate yourself, and what you can bring to the table when you finish, and the opportunities there to make a change in the education space, I suppose, with your research, to the student space, to the student union space. It's an exciting journey that keeps changing for me anyway. And I'm sure Ellen and Sherine have amazing points to add to this. So I'm going to hand over.
Yeah, I think even as you were talking about, mentorship and all, I inside the semester when now I had started doing my master's, I think I got the academic advisor came through for me. So I was able to know the options that I had for the particular course that I'd picked to do. So then it became very difficult for me to look at it at not just one point, but at like 3 points. So that is also helping me in the growth of this journey. So it was really amazing to have you today, Ellen and Jenna, and you've shared great thoughts, great insights, great opportunities that we can tap into as students. And I hope that the two of you are still helping students in your capacity as student leaders in the postgraduate space. So I'll just turn to our listeners and I would say thank you for listening in today to our very first podcast from the Global Students Forum. And I'm asking you to stay tuned and see you next time as we have our next great speakers and scholars in this particular space. Thank you very much and goodbye.